Greetings, Trinity community. Welcome to our next installment of Trinity Reads, Amos. And this week we're talking about chapter 3. I'm back with Brent Strawn. Brent, thanks for joining me again.
No, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, I really enjoy these conversations, and I just keep reading these chapters over and over again and cycling through them. They're really powerful. And I know that chapter 3 has, especially in verses 7 and 8, there's just a real powerful message here, and would love to hear you just to comment on this. The lion has roared. You talked in the first week about that image of early on in Amos that God is a roaring lion.
Right.
The lion has roared. Who will not fear? The sovereign Lord has spoken. Who can but prophesy?
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about the importance of that for Amos the prophet and
Yeah, this verse is kind of the climax of a series of rhetorical questions that Amos begins with in verse 3, and that seem to sort of suggest a kind of inevitability. Something happens and then something else happens, a cause and effect, and that the effect is inevitable. And I think that in context, the inevitable effect is not theoretical, but specifically oriented towards the punishment of God's people by God. So that verse 6 is really crucial. Does disaster befall a city unless the Lord has done it? So God is claiming to be the cause of the disaster that is going to happen to Jerusalem, or as we see here in chapter 2, or in Samaria and Bethel in chapter 3 and following. And this culmination in verse 7 and 8 really suggests that the people who know this to be the case are the prophets. And the reason why they know it is because God has told them so.
Yeah.
And so that what happens in society, according to Amos, and his own sense of what's happening, is all coming from God, not from him. So, you can't say, we don't like you, Amos, because we don't like your politics. Because he would say, it's not my politics, it's God's politics. All this goes back to God, not to me.
Yeah.
The orientation, the initiation is divine, not my own.
Yeah.
And so the Lord has roared, who can but will not fear? The Lord has spoken, who can but prophesy? This is God's doing, Amos says, not mine.
Right, yeah. Well, that sense of judgment, God's judgment, I think we're often hesitant to ascribe. I mean, there's a certain humility that comes with that, right? Like, I don't know what God's up to.
Right.
But
The
Amos is
prophets
pretty
aren't-
bold in
Yes.
saying, God is up to judgment.
That's right.
And,
That's right. The prophets aren't scared of that in the
Right.
same way we are.
yeah.
And maybe because they're bold, we can listen to them rather than have to be bold ourselves. Maybe we don't have to discern God's ways because the prophets have sort of discerned them for us. That's one way to think about Amos as God's word to us.
I did think, I've been reading some about Abraham Lincoln and how through his presidency he grew in this conviction that what was happening in this war was somehow God's judgment.
Yeah.
And you can see that in the second inaugural address is sort of this crescendo of like, it's not like I know exactly what God is doing, because there's a certain humility there. Like, I'm not sure what God is up to, but God is judging.
Right.
God, that's what God. That's part of what God always does, is that He judges unrighteousness.
And it's something that runs throughout the Bible, not just Amos, but it runs through Amos. I mean, just as you noted, the lion image is right there in chapter 1, verse 2. And it's again in chapter 3, verse 12, when Amos describes, the only way a shepherd rescues from a lion is just a piece of an ear, or a leg bone or something. I mean, nobody rescues anything from a lion. And so when God is portrayed as a lion, you're in trouble.
Right.
And if you survive, it's only going to maybe be a piece of you. And so Amos is definitely connected to that point. And for us, we have to say, but why is God judging? We have to ask why. And in the beginning of chapter 3, it's all connected to the election of Israel, God's choice of Israel. That's what leads to judgment. And that may be one of the most fascinating statements in the entire book.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times we associate election with privilege, right? It's like with special benefits. And one of those special benefits is that we will be judged particularly hard, right?
That's right. I mean, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. That's real covenantal language. You know, you only have I known. It's in kind of covenantal relationship. Therefore, I will bless you. No. Therefore, I will punish you for all your iniquities. You know, it's as Jesus says in Luke 12. You know, to whom much is given, much will be required, and to whom much is entrusted, even more will be demanded. I mean, that's the last part of that statement that I forget a lot of times that Jesus said in Luke 12. That's what's going on there. You want to be first in God's kind of, you know, family. Mm-hmm. Good for you. That means you're also first to be judged when you fail to be God's family.
Well, reading Amos for me has made me ask more acutely, what is God up to today in our world with the COVID pandemic, with the violence against African Americans and the protests and all that. And I think sometimes we want to be careful and say, well, I don't know what God's up to. But Amos was pretty bold to say God is up to judgment in specific kinds of ways in his culture and his society. He wasn't afraid of maybe even getting a little political.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, everything is in the sense political for Amos because he's dealing with the polis, you know, with the society, with the city. You know, it's intriguing that he may have been a person of means. Maybe he wasn't, you know, maybe he was just a country shepherd. But either way, it seems that he's learned a lot from his background. He's not a first career prophet. He's got another career prior to this. We learn about that in chapter 1 and chapter 7. And that's why it's so important for him to stress, this isn't my saying, this isn't my politics, these are God's politics. And I'm just telling you what I've been privy to by listening to the Lord. And so, you know, we do struggle now in discerning God's hand. But as you say, Amos didn't. And because Amos didn't, and because Amos gave us a kind of roadmap to identify this kind of movements of God and the Spirit, I think it gives us then some license and some place to think hard about these things you just raised and said, God is involved in them, and then how? Is God judging the world? Is God judging the affluent, those who've had privilege at the expense of others who haven't? And that's God's action. And even if it's more subtle than that, it can still be God's action in putting people on notice that they need to be on the side of God's politics, that they need to listen to the lion who has roared and do what they can to set the world right. And so I think either way, Amos suggests to us, God's at work in what's happening in the world. Disaster doesn't befall a city without the Lord having done it.
Yeah. It's a hard truth and a truth for mature audiences. It's you know, and you talked last week, I know, with Julie Burson about reading this book for young children.
That's right. And I mean, you know, even then, though, as hard as it is, what would become the special words we'd want our kids to remember? I think we'd want them to remember that to whom much is given, much is required, and that's what chapter 3, verse 2 is about. You only have I known, therefore I'm going to hold you accountable. That's something we would say to our kids just being a part of our family. How much more so to be part of the family of God?
Well, that's a great word for Trinity, because I think Trinity has been the beneficiary of much good. We are blessed in so many ways. And so what's required of us? It's a good, hard word for us to read. And we can read it too with confidence that the Lord's judgment, underneath the Lord's judgment is his love for us.
That's right.
He judges us because he loves us.
The judgment is therapeutic. It's for our good, for all ways. And it's like you pointed out with the lion in C.S. Lewis's work. You know, not safe, the beavers tell the children. You know, Aslan's not safe, but he's good. Definitely not safe and definitely not tame, but good.
It's a good image. Well, thanks for talking again this week. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Non nobis.